I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
All right, so this is our new podcast, Dustbowl Diatribes, which we've been working on for a while. Stop, Darnie. I'm going to put her down on the floor. She'll probably leap back up again. And so I figured that like maybe the first thing people should know is why we named this podcast Dustbowl Diatribes. I'm going to be cross-listing this with my YouTube people, and I know they would want to know that. And, you know, we just got done reading a book about the Dust Bowls of Empire, which we're going to talk more about on this podcast for sure. But I mean, to me, Dust Bowls, the 1930 Dust Bowl, and the phenomenon in general represents our inability to anticipate the problems that we cause. That's been like a recurrent theme in my life for quite a while now, is that people can't seem to anticipate that what they're doing to the environment, to each other or whatever, is going to cause problems down the road. And then when the problems happen, they just react to them. I don't know, like what you came up with the name Dust Bowl Diatribes. Like, what does it mean to you?
Well, it's in this tradition of, I really like this song called Dust Bowl Dance by Mumford & Sons. And Woody Guthrie's first album was called Dust Bowl Ballads. It's not very good, but you can find it pretty much everywhere. But especially in that Dust Bowl Dance song, that is the theme to the trailer that we put up as well, or a piano cover of it, is this feeling of exhaustion and a foreclosed future and of dryness. And I feel like in all sorts of ways, that's kind of the world we're living in, or at least certainly the world we're creating.
Why diatribes? You know, are we angry? Are we just going off here, or what? You know, why did you choose that term?
Right. I mean, I'm personally angry, mostly sad and tired. But I think since we live in a world where more and more dust bowls are going to be kicked up, both naturally and socially, economically, politically, it's a good occasion for everybody to push their own niche take on what's happening and publish their diatribe about how it's all because we're not good enough Catholics, or we're not good enough Marxists, or we haven't been good enough capitalists, or whatever. I think diatribes are in our future, as well as dust bowls.
But hopefully our diatribes will be a little bit more focused than a lot of what you hear.
Then you want to talk about the trailer?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Oh, do you want to listen to it just to refresh?
I mean, I think I have it, but if you want to re-listen to it, we can.
I want to re-listen to it. I like it anyway, so let's re-listen to it. I will just
Yeah.
This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were?
Now we can see a new world coming into view. A world in which there is the very real prospect of a new world order.
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is.
A world order in which the principles of justice and fair play protect the weak against the strong.
Our enemies are innovative and resourceful, and so are we. They never stop thinking about new ways to harm our country and our people, and neither do we.
Let us recognize that the hard work of freedom still calls us forward. We've learned the hard lessons of history.
The Jonas brothers are here. Sasha and Malia are huge fans, but boys don't get any ideas. I have 2 words for you: predator drones. You will never see it coming. You think I'm joking?
In the war just ended, there were clear-cut objectives.
It's called the American dream.
And above all, an overriding imperative to achieve results. We must bring that same sense of self-discipline, that same sense of urgency to the way we meet challenges here at home.
This is a tough hurricane, one of the wettest we've ever seen from the standpoint of water. Rarely have we had an experience like it, and it certainly is not good.
It is time for us to do what we have been doing, and that time is every day. Every day it is time for us to agree that there are things and tools that are available to us to slow this thing down.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class. But today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself. And that makes it quite dramatic, actually.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. What was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. Human beings are utterly disembedded from all communities. This is why you see white supremacy in the rise, because white people don't know who they are. And so they're creating nativist fictions. This is why there is a rise of mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
We've learned the hard lessons of history, that the hard work of freedom still calls us forward. We've learned the hard lessons of history. We've learned the hard lessons of history. We've learned the hard lessons of history. We've learned.
You think I'm joking?
So, like, since you created it, you want to just talk about it a little bit? Why you picked these things, what it means to you?
Sure. I think it shows how profoundly stupid the politicians that rise to success at the national level are, or at least how, like in the case of Trump and Kamala, right? It's like they're struggling just to even say a sentence properly.
Mm-hmm.
And so partly it's like tracking a degeneration with Trump and Kamala. And then with Bush, you have him flubbing and accidentally saying that the US government is trying to hurt its own people. And then you have the contrast with Obama making a joke about droning the Jonas brothers for asking his daughters on dates or whatever. And then the classic, it depends on what the meaning of the word is. And then throughout it all, you have this quote from Herbert Walker about, that's his famous like 1,000 points of light speech, or New World Order speech that conspiracy theorists latch onto as the Freemasons revealing whatever. But throughout it all, he seems pretty competent. And he's like, yeah, in America, we're going to be diligent. We're going to be disciplined. We're going to soberly assess the situation. We're going to tackle that problem with resolve and determination and efficiency. And then you just have all of these. Now, granted, their quotes ripped out of context. It's not the best representations of these politicians. But it shows both like the promise of the American dream and also how profoundly stupid we are and dropping the ball. And how I wanted to imply it even starts with Reagan, the idea that's going to make for good, strong marriages is a low inflation rate.
Oh boy, that worked, didn't it? Ooh, I mean, you know, obviously marriages continue to not be. He didn't fix the marriage problem. Let's put it that way. Wow. Well, I like it. Yeah, to me, I mean, when I heard it the first time, it made me feel somewhat the same way, but just that there's a sense of kind of like futility and stupidity. Like, yeah, we sure listen to these politicians talk a good line, and people somehow continue to buy this stuff. I mean, it's one thing, you know, it's kind of like if you're young, you've got an excuse to buy bullshit, basically, that, you know, is being repeated by a politician. But when you get into your 50s, 60s, 70s and above, which is where a lot of folks are that are like heavily, you know, political now, and they're still buying this stuff, you realize how profoundly idiotic at a sort of core level people can be.
But what's the alternative? Despair, settling into religious devotions that will allow you to cope with your impending death and passing on a more degraded world to your progeny.
Well, despair is the first step, perhaps. I mean, true despair is like hopelessness, which of course is not only not productive, it's a sin, but like actually realizing how profoundly stupid human beings have been and how
meaning how stupid you yourself have been.
Yeah, me included.
Me, our parents.
Yep, every one of us.
The listener.
Too much time thinking and doing things that are not productive or make things worse. I think if once you realize that, that's got to be the first step. It may not happen that you take the second step, but it's the first step towards actually doing something useful. Because if you can't admit your own idiocy and that of the people that you have admired and listened to in the past, you can't move on. And you can't think for yourself effectively.
Sure. Nor can you think so well that you can then meet up with other. I mean, this was the original liberal dream. I'm going to think for myself. You're going to think for yourself. We're all going to think for ourselves. And we're all on that basis of rationally thinking for ourselves. We'll live in a consensual social world where we can then organize.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we'll be able to do that because we'll be able to think in terms of our long-term rational self-interest.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll be able to cooperate on that basis without disagreeing, and we'll be shorn of prejudices and superstitions and narcissism and all these things. So yeah, I think it's a very clarifying intro. And I think it's good to what you just pointed out, that includes you, me, and everybody else. If you think that you've escaped this sort of like stupid optimism or belief in leadership to, fix things, you haven't,
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult to do so.
Right. So we're making an argument for a kind of melancholic insight being like the start of seeing things clearly,
Right.
admitting that you don't know.
I don't know. I'm angry too. The other day I was in class and I was, I mentioned Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry of the Future in a book. It's a good book. It's a very scary book. And I've never in my life, in all my years of teaching, gotten close to crying. and I almost did when I mentioned that book, because it envisions a time when there's a huge heat wave that rolls through India and kills 20 million people. And what does society do in the wake of that? What does international society do? They go back to normal after a while. It doesn't even take very long. And, for people who are serious about environmental issues, about climate change, this is our worst fear, So I'm angry, I'm sad as well. And to a certain extent, this title it feels like a title of mourning. And I think we do need to mourn. You have to mourn the loss, that we are experiencing of our planet's health, of our children's future. It's not going to be as rosy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mourning, as well as coming to see clearly that in this situation with climate change, this is a direct result of the modernization and financialization of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And,
right.
and so partly we took out a loan that when we let individuals reason, and when we would follow the scientific method, and when we would convert natural resources into cities and factories, that the rising tide would lift all boats and it would be all good. And now we're defaulting on that in a sense. Now we're saying, oh, we've let loose these natural and social forces that we no longer can control.
Mm-hmm. And so it's either futile and there's nothing we can do about it, or we dream about really kind of cockamamie schemes like transferring our pollution and industry in space, and serious uber rich individuals like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are pouring billions into that vision, because they, among other things, they even recognize without some sort of drastic action, we're in a world of trouble because we've taken out a loan we haven't repaid. And there's only so many of those resources to use, and we're using them up on many things that don't even matter and that actually make our lives worse. And, to really clearly see this, for me, it's sad. I am a parent. I have a son. I don't want him to grow up in a world where he has to worry about these things, but that's what's going to happen. one of the things I hear from my students is we know that life is not going to be as good as you guys had it. We know that. So they're kind of coming to terms with that. And I'm hoping that this podcast will especially address people in their, 20s and 30s who can, who kind of understand some of this already, but maybe still haven't taken the next step. Not to do something like what Bezos wants them to do, which is join the freaking Space Force, but to change their lives and the lives of people around them in ways so that their lives are at least safe. I don't know if anybody can be safe, but so that we can adapt. I did want to say that this podcast falls under the Morin Academy, which is named after Peter Morin and is inspired by the Catholic worker movement, which was also co-founded by Dorothy Day. And so that will enter in, and I will put the Morin Academy's website into the show notes so people can take a look at that. And also I wanted to add, in there, I will be teaching a class on Christian anarchism this summer. So if you're interested in taking that class, that's part of the Morin Academy. We'll talk about it more on this podcast, but you can find out information about it at the Morin Academy website. So like before we go much further, maybe we should tell people who the heck we are. Which one of us should go first?
I mean, you can.
Okay, well, I am Dr. Laurie Johnson. I am a professor of political philosophy, and I run the political philosophy YouTube channel, so some of you will recognize me from that. Well, what else about me? I am from a working class town in Illinois, from Rock Island, Illinois, that was heavily involved in the manufacturing of farm implements. So I grew up in a world where I learned how a lot of people live. I lived around a lot of people who didn't have a whole lot of money. And as I was growing up, my family were generally politically liberal. My dad definitely kind of led the way there. And he identified with working class concerns because he came from he's the first person in his family to earn not only a high school diploma, but a master's degree. And went on to be a teacher, but he started off helping his dad in the roofing industry as a roofer. Anyway, religiously speaking, since that's part of what we're talking about too, I've been a Protestant of almost every kind. We went from this to that, Methodist, Presbyterian. Then when I got married, I became a Lutheran because my ex-husband was a Lutheran, and I liked that. But I liked it so much that I ended up converting to Catholicism because Lutheranism is pretty close to Catholicism. That being said, I have a respect for just about anybody who has religious faith of any kind. But, I went to undergrad at NIU, Northern Illinois University, but in grad school, I stayed there and I got into political philosophy, the Straussian school at the NIU. So I learned a lot from the professors there. Got out, kind of mixed things up in order there, got married, converted to Catholicism. And of course, now I'm not married, but I'm still a Catholic. And I'm also a member of Word of Life Church in St. Joseph, Missouri. Don't ask me how that works, but nobody's objected yet. So I've got one foot in the Catholic world and one foot in a Protestant world, but a non-denominational church that is very much decidedly not Christian nationalist and is very in tune with certain Catholic practices and also has decent theological grounding. So I don't know. I don't know what else to say about me, except for I just love to grow stuff. I'm kind of into permaculture. Uh, I love what Spencer's doing, and you can tell people about that. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about how we even know each other. But like, do you want to just tell folks who you are too, and your background?
Yeah, my name's Spencer Hess, and I was born in Dodge City, Kansas in the early 90s. And I just grew up a pretty normal-ish middle-class life. Around age 21, I had a transformation, I guess, on multiple levels, like religious and political. For growing up during the Bush years, it was totally evident to me that Republicans were like full of shit. And so from age like 19 to 21, I tried out being a Democrat, like hypothetically. So I did like all the right things and I educated myself to be a good Democrat. And by the age 21, and part of it is by that time we'd had several years of the Obama administration. So all the hope and change that had clearly not really led to anything different, other than a shitty healthcare bill, and better vibes. And we could feel good because our president was cool and smart. I basically got radicalized, and I didn't know this was the term until I met Laurie and later in college, but I basically developed a fundamental problem with liberalism, period. I came to see that like there was nothing in mainstream American political life that could like radically deal with the fundamental problems at the heart of who we are and how we organize our society. So from there, I converted to a general Protestant Christianity. I'm in the stages of formally converting to Catholicism. I've been pulled kind of kicking and screaming in that direction for a while now. And I live in Kansas City, where I work part-time at a nonprofit urban farming company. And I have my own little homestead also in Kansas City, and I work basically full-time there. And then I do part-time contractor work as well to keep the lights on, as it's become increasingly apparent that there's no realistic way to make even decent money farming. And in the process, I do a lot of reading and thinking about politics and religion and world history and things like that. So I don't know, did I leave anything out that you think I should include?
Not right now, because I find your, like your story on what you have tried to do and how difficult it's been, especially to be a local or small farmer, is really interesting, and it really kind of deserves a show in and of itself, actually, because it says so much about the situation we find ourselves in, where people are told, oh, you want to change the world, go do this, go attach yourself to a plot of land and become an urban farmer or some sort of an organic small producer, and there will be people there to support you, and it'll all be wonderful and wholesome. And what you found out is that just is so hard, and that most people who do it either quit or they have to adapt and do something else to kind of support themselves. But that's really like,
yeah,
let's still have a whole show to it.
Or they're already wealthy enough that they can play the long game, and what you're really doing is just gentrifying your area.
Yeah, you're like, you have a hobby farm in that case. You're not expecting to make money off of this or to be able to support yourself from it. And yeah, that's a whole nother order. A lot of our farms that are listed as farms in the United States that are used to, for the statistic that we've got so many family farms, an outrageous number of those are hobby farms that have no intention of actually seriously being like a business, but that's often used to kind of counteract this notion that small farms and small businesses are going under, and unable to compete. But yeah, one thing I left out was, which I better explain. It's kind of hard to explain, but no harder to explain than any other, like flip-flopping. But I was a liberal in the US sense, like as in progressive, all the way through grad school. So I was still kind of in my family's political zone. But coming out of grad school, I had this seeming epiphany that Democrats hadn't solved major problems like poverty and crime and drug use and just general like urban decay and horrible education, public education and stuff like that I had cared about. And at that time, the Republicans were talking a good line about how they were going to be able to solve all those problems. And we're really, doing a full court press. And I got caught up in that. And especially when I got married, my ex-husband was a Republican. And so he reinforced that. And so I flipped over to being a fairly ideological kind of, not during the Reagan administration, but the Bush administration, but kind of like a Reagan Republican. And was that for quite a long time, because I was so dissatisfied with the performance of Democrats. Now, what's happened over time is, and this is partly due to you and, the book club that you invited to me 10 years ago now, I think around 10 years ago, is that I've slowly begun to accept that Democrats and Republicans are about the same, and neither one of them has even really tried too hard to solve these problems, and has been kind of almost parasitic. They have a parasitic quality on the body politic. And so I've absorbed quite a bit of Marxian economics, and I generally agree with it. I did when I was younger too. That's the thing, is I got confused when I was younger and thought that Democrats represented a different view of capitalist economics. And when they did not actually like fix anything, but just perpetuated problems, I got disillusioned. Anyway, I've gone through multiple changes.
And then re-illusioned that somehow or other the Republicans, through small enterprises in the inner cities, were going to fix things.
Yeah, enterprise zones and all that. They sounded like they at least cared, like they reached out to and spoke to all these different groups and seemed to be devising plans and strategies for reinvigorating small and medium-sized businesses, and for minorities and women even to get involved. And they talked a good line, but and maybe some of them were sincere, but the corporate juggernaut was not stopped, and they didn't do anything to stop it. And so there's no way that those things, even if money was poured into them, that they were going to be successful. So yes, I got re-enchanted. And I think that especially the sort of right, what do you want to call it? The sort of like nationalist rightward turn of the Republicans in recent years has just sort of sealed my conviction that the Republicans have no answers, they're kind of crazy right now. But even if they weren't, I would never go back. And so I think we both are in the zone of Marxianism, which is not straight up Marxism, as though you have to have some sort of allegiance to every jot and tittle of what Karl Marx had to say. But the general economic analysis I've come to agree with. Yep.
And most crucially, the idea that society is dominated by this abstract logic of always having to take more in profit than you give to your workers, and that any order founded on this is inherently unstable.
Mm-hmm.
Is to me that I take to be the rational core of Marxism. So there's no stability on top of that basis, because it's a permanent revolution.
Yeah, it's a system where the only way it can survive is through constant growth, because there's otherwise it simply sort of implodes, because it runs on paying people as little as possible, and yet it also needs new markets and consumers all the time. And that's why Marx and Engels predicted these crises of overproduction and basically recessions and depressions, which happen all the time in the capitalist cycle. And capitalism's response to that is to expand, try to find new markets, new ways to sell things, and to kind of stave off through an awful lot of borrowing to a lot of leverage, the ultimate conclusion of the irrationality of it, And at this point, it's produced so much waste, just so much waste, not only in things that are polluting our planet, but that's clogging up our minds and our hearts and our spiritual lives and wasting people's time.
And has, a huge amount of us doing bullshit jobs.
Yes, absolutely. Just wasting people's lives. We only have one life, and you don't want to live it, working 40 to 60 hours a week, doing something, producing something, or doing something that isn't even not only necessary, but detrimental to people's lives and health, which is a lot of what a lot of people do now in the name of economic growth and keeping the whole thing going. So it's reached its logical terminus. If it ever had one could argue that at the beginning, capitalism provided this platform of technology and of resources and knowledge that maybe couldn't have accelerated as fast any other way. But it's showing its downside for sure at this point. And yet we don't think that we can supersede it. I think, nobody thinks we can supersede it or move beyond it.
No. Well, and in large part, 99% of us don't even if you and I are right that this is the core of Marxism, even at least half of Marxists don't understand that, let alone the rest of society that's still caught up in ideas that the problem with capitalism is there's greedy people or there's poor people, as if there always haven't been greedy and poor people.
Right. And I think that's why both of us are comfortable with the term Marxianism, because I think we acknowledge that there are other areas of growth in the human being that are being suppressed by this madness of, everlasting economic growth, to the point where we're fantasizing about putting it in space, which is our spiritual growth, our intellectual growth, our friendship and relational growth, all of these things that people are suffering from a lack of right now in a serious way, why we have so much mental illness, why we have so many health issues too. We're just sacrificing our minds, our spirits, and our bodies to the system at this point. And a true, nothing but materialist Marxist doesn't concern themselves as much with those types of values.
Part of my conversion and experience to Catholicism over the last several months has been being exposed to normal rank and file Catholics. And they believe all sorts of interesting things I've learned. And one of them is that they're still absorbed by these old Marian apparitions to these peasant children at Fatima. And one of the things that Our Lady allegedly said was that Russia, this was in 1917, Russia is going to infect the world with communism and atheism and materialism is how these things are interpreted. And to me, it's such an interesting claim to imagine that Russia, even in 1917 or whenever, at any time, that atheism and materialism coming out of Russia are some, as opposed to all the atheism and materialism coming out of the Enlightenment and Western Europe and America for hundreds of years prior to that. The killer's already in our house. Right. And one of the ways we have these insane diatribes is we imagine that no, it's radical secularists who want communism. Those people are the problem, and they are kind of the problem. But so are people who imagine that capitalism can be Christianized and humanized, as if it is itself isn't atheistic and materialistic.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was something that came out of the seminar on distributism that we did last summer. But I mean, both of us knew this long time ago, was that capitalism and communism are two branches on the same enlightenment tree. So at the beginning of the Enlightenment, you get there's the roots of a certain type of secularism, for sure, secularism amounting to almost atheism, if not outright atheism, because of materialism, because of the desire for an adulation of technological growth. I mean, think about the Cold War period. There was a battle between the United States and the Soviet Union over who could have the most groceries in their stores. The Soviet Union had to make it up. They like had one like model grocery store and they stocked it with all sorts of stuff. But and then they took pictures of it. But I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not much. But like that was their dream too. Mm-hmm. They wanted to electrify their country. They wanted to introduce heavy industry. They wanted to make better cars than us. They wanted to make better spaceships than us. They just thought they could do it better. And, so yeah, there's not nearly as much difference between those two systems as people want to imagine. And they both of them leave out that the spiritual core of the human being. So I think you're right. People should look to their own system. If you're living in the United States or Western Europe or in some other liberal democratic country and under capitalism, there you will find, atheism, materialism, gross individualism, selfishness,
sure.
Yada, yada.
Nihilism, in a word.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, that may be a perspective that is hard for people to understand at first, but hopefully we'll be able to kind of unpack that as time goes by. I often, tell my students, don't think in terms of either or us versus them, but both are wrong and both are right in a way, to be able to see that these systems and these ideologies that people have been taught are very much opposed, actually have a lot in common, leaves space for a third way potentially. And the Catholic worker movement, the theory of distributism, even though it's got like some serious problems, but it poses a potential third way. Christian anarchism more generally does, which probably sounds scary to people, but that's partly what we're about, and I think we can unpack that over time as well.
Sure. And I would also argue, I think this is an argument, I think I heard it years ago from Fulton Sheen, this idea that it's not a matter of just left and right and center, but there are also ways upwards and within.
Yeah. That's right. That's territory that we have not traversed much in the last few hundred years.
And we will do anything else to avoid, we will swallow all sorts of camels to avoid swallowing that gnat.
Yeah. Well, I went to a retreat this weekend, and part of it was 2.5 hours, I think, of silent meditation. Where we weren't supposed to talk to each other. I did spend some of that time listening to the Ministry of the Future because I felt like I needed to absorb that again. But one thing I noticed was like that seemed to be the hardest part of that retreat for most of the people. I went off and I was the happiest I've been all weekend long. But I think for most people, to be alone with themselves and to find meaning within themselves and begin to not become narcissistically obsessed with themselves, but just to sit with themselves and not be distracted may mean that you begin to realize that something's wrong. I think that's why people avoid it. Mm-hmm.
Which is one of the core contradictions of ourselves right now. Is on the one hand, we are told to be individualistic and think for ourselves. And then on the other hand, we're practically like hyper extroverted. Hyper
extroverted comes out in, texting and posting Instagram and Twitter, and they took people's phones away, and that was another thing that was pretty traumatic for folks, was not to be able to constantly kind of push outward every feeling and thought that they had, which reinforced I've got to confront myself and how much of my time is being wasted on these things. We left out like how we met. So like, as I recall, and did we talk about this already?
No.
Okay. So as I recall, the first time I didn't actually meet you, you were a student in one of my online classes. So I didn't like meet you in person, but you were in an online class. And then you got into a program I directed, and took another class from me. And along the way, you invited me to this farm club book club, because you were in the student farm club. You're a horticulture major, and I believe you were the president of that club, weren't you, at that point?
I mean, it floated around. Sometimes I was vice president, sometimes president.
Okay. Well, I'd never heard of the student farm club, and it has a hard time, like to this day. It had a hard time when you were doing it, and it has a hard time now, because the university that I'm at doesn't really adequately support it. Like they don't, it's run through the ag college, but yet you would think that an ag college would offer credit to students to actually learn farming techniques on a farm, but it does not. And so they relied on volunteers, and they still do, like students that just come out, for no credit, kind of on their own. And I remember you struggling with that. But anyway, I joined that book club and started learning more about some of the things that you're concerned with. We read Michael Pollan's The Omnivore's Dilemma to start out with. I remember we read Wendell Berry's The Unsettling of America, and I got an education in, the state of the environment, which I had always kind of held at bay. I think, like most Americans, I kind of knew it was an issue out there, but hadn't really given it the thought that it deserved. And one thing I can say, like, that's good about myself is once I read and understand facts, whether I like them or not, I do accept them. And so it's clear to me that we do have a serious problem on multiple levels. Social, political, economic, environmental. Climate change is real. It is going to get us. It probably is too late to stop some catastrophic effects of it and all of that. So I appreciate the fact that you invited me and I got an education. Well, that started off on campus, but I invited people back to my home, and we had lots and lots of meetings of that book club around my front dining room, large table. And that kept going for years. Finally kind of dwindled off after you took off. You graduated and went on your way to do some woofing and stuff. But it got reestablished on Zoom, and so we're still back doing it. Now we call it Cultivating Critique. It's kind of our little think tank. So anyway, like, that's what I remember of how we met. And over time, I feel like I've learned at least as much from you as you've learned from me. So it was a natural for me to want to do this podcast with you.
More so you introduced me to conservatism, like Burke. And I immediately got Burke.
That's cool. Yeah. Like, yeah. Most people don't know what conservatism really means and what it still means in other countries. And, Burkean conservatism is a whole different thing than US conservatism. Like what? I mean, maybe.
Well, I would argue there's a strand of Burkean conservatism that's still preserved in like my dad's moderate republicanism.
Okay, how so?
Just this humility that societies take a long time to build, and it is not prudent to mess with them willy-nilly and think you can just revolutionize everything.
Well, then he's a very different kind of Republican than most Republicans have been for the past 30 or 40 years. So I would agree with, I mean, if that's his attitude, I think a lot of Republicans have become very revolutionary and don't have any problem switching things up constantly, screwing around with the tax code, changing incentives, coming up.
Well, that's just them winning the fight against the radical Democrats. So they need to do that to preserve the social fabric of America.
Okay, well,
that's how you square that circle.
That's the rhetorical guise under which you do things like privatizing, government agencies and absorbing a great deal of the private economy under the government framework in the name of privatizing to create an even bigger government while you talk about it being really smaller. But yeah, like there's sort of like a sentimental, philosophical conservatism there, but when you look beneath the surface, it's like radical, it's constant churning and changing and screwing around with the way people work and live.
And that's how liberalism and modernity work.
And that is what disturbed Edmund Burke so much was, this is why he was a critic of liberalism, because he could see it had that really dynamic revolutionary quality in capitalism. He was suspect of the type of finance capitalism, right, that dominates our world now.
Sure.
And it just creates too much change and rupture and dislocation. It destroys communities and traditions.
But after all of that destruction, there is now the opportunity to creatively reorganize it.
And reorganize it, and reorganize it, and reorganize it, which
Sure.
makes more money, which is, the old, we got to keep that growth. We've got to destroy so that we can rebuild, because we need to make that money. We need to make jobs.
Sure.
I thought you were going to say there is a certain traditionalism in the Republicans to this day when it comes to moral matters. It's very puritanical and strange, but
sure.
But I think there is some overlap there.
There too, sure. Now, my argument would be that that's crucial because we can't confront that the problem is inside of us and within our very own economic system, that we need to displace the fight onto the culture wars. And that's what a lot of this stuff is.
Yeah.
And then we can imagine that the fight of, Judeo-Christian morality versus nihilism and subjective relativism is only in the cultural sphere, as if as if economics is untainted.
Yeah, amen to that. That's exactly right. And it has its corollary in the woke culture as well. It's just the flip side of the same coin, fighting the battles in that sort of ideational sphere, just in the sphere of pure, thoughts and emotions, ping-ponging back and forth. Meanwhile, the juggernaut of capitalism just continues to churn people's lives and basically use those conflicts to sell more stuff. I mean, anxiety and anger sell stuff for sure.
Sure. So that's happening on one hand. On the other hand, you can get more radicalized. You can become like an anarchist or a Marxist, or you can become like a radical Catholic or whatever. But then you're in this weird situation where you are now so many standard deviations away from the norm. There's no way you're going to organize even the people in your community, let alone some sort of actual revolution to rectify things along more radical grounds. So this too becomes some weird like onanistic subculture where you're probably talking with people online and telling yourselves how smart you are and how you see through all the bullshit and how you're among the like righteous remnant, but then it's also like, so what?
And this is what, like your life for the past 10 years has been trying to like work through in your own practice what to do. And it's been difficult, but that's what your focus has been. And I think that's what people really want. So even though it's going to be hard, I think that's where we need to go. I know we're going to talk about Dust Bowls of Empire, that book by Hannah Holloman, who's an assistant professor of sociology at Amherst. And it was a good book. We'll talk about it, I'm sure, in the next few sessions. But in the end, the group was disappointed because it didn't, like so many books, it didn't take that next step and say, okay, what can people do? Especially since obviously government has failed. Corporations are a problem. And when they talk about fixing the problem, it's ludicrous. Like,
I mean, and that's where you and I have kind of settled on Catholic worker. We're both somewhat uncomfortable with a lot of Dorothy Day's theoretical conclusions, but I think you and I are agreed that Christian anarchism is the way to sort of synthesize Christian orthodoxy with actual practice and doing. It can synthesize Orthodox Christianity with actually materially doing things, whether it's running a homestead or organizing a community.
I think that the Catholic worker movement, like any movement, has its flaws in practice, but it's one of the closest things in our world to Christians trying to actually not just talk the talk, but walk the walk and embrace certain principles that make sense, such as not relying on government to solve problems at the local level that they themselves can do something about, or not simply writing a check and hoping that some nonprofit hands things out. Now, in practice, that can get kind of muddled, but I think that, one of the things that has bothered me a lot over the years is, the tendency for Christians to just talk and, go to church and sort of almost self-therapize, but to never really ask the question, how can we help each other? How can we create a stronger community? One of the things the Word of Life Church talks about a little bit is that, like, to their credit, they've at least gotten this notion that community should start at the church. And the next step would be more concrete, like material support. That's what I'm interested in,
I agree. Now, my only caveat to this is, even if we figure out some sort of Catholic worker localism, the problem is still what's going to organize things at the national and international level. And my foreboding is that techno-feudalism is on the way, and we're still going to be dominated, if not outright owned, by corporations. And the only obvious alternative to that is some sort of communist international, but this is a ways out. And to even run a functional Catholic worker farm or house of hospitality is already pretty utopian, I've learned.
Oh, Lord. I don't think you've ever talked to me about the Communist International. I don't know if I want to go there.
Yeah, or something that would fulfill whatever, call it the United Nations.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm suspicious that any sort of international organization isn't going to ever be successful. They never have. But what I guess what I would, this will be interesting because you and I will perhaps, have some disagreements about this, but I kind of think along our friend Jacob Honshu's lines of rhizomatic growth, right? And I think you're interested in that too. In other words, can you, within that techno-feudalism, or whatever you want to call it, the situation that's emerging, where we're governed more by our corporations than by our governments. And in either case, it's difficult for people to actually like have and do independent action. I like the idea of trying to figure out how people can work under that system and to a certain extent separate themselves from it in a way that is replicable, even though it may be changeable from situation to situation, that there may be things that people can do that are replicable and usable in different environments that could spread rhizomatically rather than in a sort of larger organizational way. But I mean, I understand your tendency to think that we need some sort of political action. I do.
Right. Otherwise, you're caught up in this sort of, it's both a kind of right liberalism, but also this like postmodernism where somehow or other groups are going to autonomously organize themselves. And my experience of, to various degrees, being in groups that try to do this is it's different kinds of shit shows. And what I always keep coming back to is we're still dominated by capitalist logic and our own human fallibility and frailty. And so these images of, you know, the rhizomatic spreading or being the virus that takes over the host or whatever, misses the fact that usually the host body is going to kill the virus. Or like it's a cute image, but if you think you're just going to thread the needle, you're probably not.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. But on the other hand, I don't think governmental structures, which is probably maybe not even what you're referring to, I don't think they work. I think it's clear the United Nations doesn't work. Very clearly, it doesn't work. Right now, it's not working. And it never has. And that's because as long as there are nation states, they will only do what they want to do under that structure. But if you're talking about some sort of international organization like the Communist International, that's a sort of like ideological organization to inspire people or to provide like advice and structure, maybe I can get on board with some idea like that.
I mean, I'm making an argument that at a certain point, we'll probably need some sort of hive mind to just move resources around.
Yes. Yes, and that's got to start somewhere. That's interesting. All right, well, but I don't know if, I mean, so we'll get lost in that. That's sure. Like another conversation of itself. So we probably should like.
And just to briefly explicate what I'm saying, I understand that the danger of like totalitarianism is very real, but also we already have this Communist International. It's just called like capitalist logic. So It's not a matter of we need to be afraid to build this thing. It's already been made.
Okay. That's that I like that. That's true.
And it's kicking up dust bowls all over the place.
It governs our lives. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, you've given me some food for thought, so I appreciate that. I went through a period of about 2 or 3 days a few weeks ago where I couldn't open my mouth, you know, like I could hardly say anything because I was contemplating this very thing. And I realized sometimes the only smart thing to do is to say nothing at all. So we're kind of tempting fate here doing a podcast, you know, or talking about this kind of thing at all. But I think that we just have to keep firmly in mind our own fallibility and everybody's fallibility. And yes, it's okay to basically take a stance of mourning in order to maybe find your way to some sort of concrete action.
Sure. As Zizek calls it, the courage of hopelessness.
Right, right. So let's have the courage of hopelessness. moving forward with Dustbowl Diatribes.
Because if not, we just get sucked into worse diatribes and narratives, I think.
Yeah. And I don't want to spend any more of my life getting sucked into any other narrative or story that isn't true. And hopefully some other people feel the same way and will want to tune in and listen to this. So welcome aboard, folks. Gird your loins. We will not be always positive, but we're doing it for a reason.